Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Bigelow. I'm the Director of the West Asia Program here at the Lowy Institute. Welcome to today's Wednesday Lowy Lunch. It's quite interesting. It's one of the first Wednesday Lowy Lunches. We've had full rooms before, but not quite this full. I think there's even a seat for me left. And that's a great testament to the speaker that we have with us today, Ambassador Martin Indyk. Martin probably requires very little introduction, but I'll do it anyway. He's currently a Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and he's a Director of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy there. Martin is also, of course, a Director here at the Lowy Institute on our board. In his past life, he served for 2 terms as US Ambassador to Israel. He's a former Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs in the US Department of State. He's also served as a Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs in the National Security Council. In addition, he was Executive Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and Adjunct Professor at Johns Hopkins University. And of course, before becoming an American, Martin was an Australian, having held a number of government and university positions here before he left. All of this makes him eminently qualified to write the book about which he has come to talk to us today. The book's entitled Innocent Abroad, an intimate account of American peace diplomacy in the Middle East. You may have noticed some copies out there in the foyer, and I encourage you all to buy one. In this business, timing is everything, and Martin's timing, I think, with this book is impeccable. Today we have a new president in the White House with a serious interest in peacemaking in the Middle East. And I can think of no better book for President Obama to read for an account of the triumphs and the failures of what was arguably the last really serious foray by an American administration into Israeli-Arab peacemaking. Martin spares few egos in this book, least of all his own. Ultimately, however, it's not about apportioning blame, but figuring out how best to learn from the successes and mistakes of the past. In this regard, Martin provides one very good piece of advice in his concluding chapter. He writes that some of the most important requirements of successful American Middle Eastern diplomacy are humility, flexibility, and agility. Let's hope that the President is listening. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Martin Indyk.
I'm out here for just a short visit to talk about my book, and that's what I wanted to do today, and have a chance to discuss it with you. The book itself is the end of a long journey which began back in 1973, October 1973, when I was an Australian student in Jerusalem, and suddenly the Yom Kippur War of October 1973 broke out. That was a defining moment in my life, and for reasons that I won't belabor here, I took on a magnificent obsession, which was somehow that I would study, write, teach, and ultimately practice the art of American diplomacy in the Middle East in an effort to try to help resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. 1973 war, I was very much taken by the role that the United States played. First of all, in backing Israel up in its efforts to turn the tide of battle, but more importantly, in the shuttle diplomacy that Henry Kissinger then initiated, first to get a ceasefire, then disengagement agreements that laid the foundations for the Arab-Israeli peacemaking that has taken place over the last 3 decades. Through a series of unusual, even serendipitous events, I found myself 20 years later going into the White House as President Clinton's Middle East advisor on his first day in office. And when I first briefed the President about the situation in the Middle East, at that time, I explained to him that the collapse of the Soviet Union had robbed those Arab states who would try to resolve their grievances with Israel through war making, had robbed them of a superpower patron. And the defeat of Saddam Hussein's army in the first Gulf War, when he was evicted from Kuwait, had also removed any chance of an Eastern Front coalition being formed against Israel. And as a consequence, all of the Arab state neighbours of Israel and the Palestinians were, at the time that Clinton came into office, engaged in direct negotiations with Israel. And Yitzhak Rabin had just been elected Prime Minister of Israel with, as he told the president in their first meeting in March of 1993, with a mandate to take calculated risks for peace. So it was, I argued to the president, a unique moment in which all the stars seemed to have aligned in the right orbit, or put it differently, that a window of opportunity had opened quite wide for an American effort to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I said to him that if he put his mind to it, he could achieve in his first term in office 4 peace agreements in Israel, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinians, and he could reasonably aspire to ending the Arab-Israeli conflict in his first term. I know it sounds grandiose and somewhat absurd to imagine that such a thing could be achieved today, but in those early days of the Clinton administration, it seemed very possible. And Clinton responded to me very simply, I want to do that. And he, true to his word, spent the next 8 years, he did a few other things, as we know, but the Middle East was a priority for him, and he has spent a good deal of prestige of his office and the influence of the United States in trying to effect that objective of an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. The story is fairly well known, although I've tried in the book to recount it in terms of an insider's view of it in a way that I think brings new facts to light and new understanding of it, what happened. But if I were to summarize it as quickly as I can, essentially we started with breakthroughs between Israel and the Palestinians, the signing of the Oslo Accords, September of 1993. 13 months later, we had the signing of the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty. And Clinton then sent me, 5 months after that, out to Israel to be his ambassador there, to work with Yitzhak Rabin on the secret negotiations which we were working on at that time with the president of Syria to try to achieve a breakthrough on the Syrian front. And when I went out to Israel in April of 1995, it looked very likely that we would be able to achieve the breakthrough with the Syrians in short order, because Rabin had agreed, and we had conveyed to President Assad of Syria that he was prepared to make a full withdrawal to the line of June 4th, 1967 from the Golan Heights. And with that, we could create a breakthrough on the Lebanese track as well. The Syrians essentially controlled Lebanon in those days. And we would have achieved our objectives. 5 months into that effort, 5 months after I arrived in Israel, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. And the whole process began to crater. Bibi Netanyahu was elected Prime Minister of Israel with a narrow right-wing coalition and a very different mandate, in effect, to take no risks for peace. And in that environment, it became very difficult to make progress, compounded by Saddam Hussein, who was now rattling his cage and creating problems for us on that front, and the failure of our efforts at that time to engage Iran through the auspices of the newly elected moderate reformist leader, Mohammad Khatami. And as a consequence, we were facing great difficulties in making any progress, just holding to what we'd managed to achieve. Whereas the wind had been at our backs in the first 2 years, now the wind was very much in our faces. We worked very hard with Netanyahu and got him finally, in the Y agreement, to agree to a withdrawal from 13.1% of the West Bank. And once he signed up to that, his government collapsed. And lo and behold, Ehud Barak is elected Prime Minister in June of 1999, comes to Washington for his first meeting with Clinton and says to Clinton, let's finish the job in your last year in office, in my first year in office. We'll redeem Rabin's legacy together. And by the way, I want you to send Indyk back to Israel to work with me. So I returned to Israel in the beginning of 2000, thinking that here was the second chance to achieve that comprehensive peace that Clinton had set as his objective 7 years earlier. And the whole thing created again on the same timetable in 5 months. The real tragedy was the failure to get an agreement between Israel and Syria, which is what Clinton and Barak focused on first. I say it was a real tragedy because in December of 1999, Hafez al-Assad told us that he was ready to do the deal. He had only one requirement, which was to do it quickly. They have to understand that quickly was not in Assad's lexicon. He had lectured us repeatedly about how haste was from the devil and had constantly added new requirements whenever we had met his requirements. For 7 years, he played around with us, even though he had a commitment from 3 Israeli prime ministers at that point to make a full withdrawal from the Golan Heights. Nevertheless, we were unable in one way or another to achieve the breakthrough there. And suddenly he wants to do it, and he wants to do it quickly. And he sends his foreign minister to negotiate with the Israeli prime minister. And at that moment, the deal could have been done. Indeed, in 2 rounds of negotiations that we held at the end of 1999, the beginning of 2000, essentially all of the issues between Israel and Syria were resolved, except for the question of a narrow strip of territory around the Sea of Galilee in its northeastern quadrant. That was essentially all that remained to be done. But in February of 2000, at Shepherdstown, Barak was not ready to do the deal. Worried about whether he would be able to bring his people along with a deal that would have led to withdrawal in full from the Golan Heights, he wanted to play out the negotiations for another round, believing that he had to show his people that he was being a tough negotiator before he made the ultimate concession of all of the territory. 2 months later, when Clinton met with Assad in Geneva and presented a map from Barak with the line of withdrawal from the Golan Heights demarcated on it, it was too late. Assad was coming to the end of his life, was already suffering dementia. He died 2 months later, and at that point, he seems to have decided that he only had one act left in him, which was to put his son in power. And he said no. And so we had this ships passing in the night. When one side was ready, the other side was not. And the other side was ready, it was too late. And we're only talking about a matter of a couple of months. The consequences of missing the Syrian deal were profound for the next effort, which was to turn to Yasser Arafat and to try to make the Palestinian-Israeli deal. Because Arafat went from a situation in which he was fearful that he was about to get left behind as Syria made the deal with Israel and Lebanon would follow, and then the other Arab states would also join in, because Syria was, the beating heart of Arab nationalism. If Syria made peace, there was no reason for any of them not to. And Arafat would have had to scramble to grab what he could get in that situation. Now he found himself in the catbird seat, with Barack and Clinton chasing after him, starting at Camp David, but going on for another 6 months until the end of Clinton's time in office. Barack and Clinton pursued Arafat with increasingly better offers, until at the end of the administration, after 6 months of detailed final status negotiations, Clinton presented a proposal that Arafat had told us he was willing to accept, that it met his requirements, that the other Arab leaders had told us they were willing to support, and Barack was willing to accept it as well. And Clinton then put that plan on the table, became known as the Clinton parameters, for an independent Palestinian state in all of Gaza and 94 to 97% of the West Bank, with the borders to be negotiated, but within those parameters, with territorial compensation for territory the Palestinians would give up to Israel, so that the settlement blocks along the Green Line could be incorporated into Israel. In Jerusalem, all of the Arab suburbs would be under Palestinian sovereignty, including 3/4 of the Old City, and the surface of the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located, would be under Palestinian sovereignty, and there would be a fair resolution of the Palestinian refugee problem, such that Palestinians would have the right to return to the state of Palestine, but they would not have the right to return to Israel. Let's say it was an offer that Arafat told us met his needs. And yet when Clinton put the offer on the table, Arafat prevaricated. Shimon Peres at the time said to me that history is like a horse that gallops past your window, and the true act of a statesman is to jump from the window onto this galloping horse. Now, if you think about it, it's not such a simple proposition. But that was the challenge that Arafat faced at that moment. He would have had to stand before his people and tell them, I got you Jerusalem, but you refugees will not have the right to return to Israel. And at that moment, with the Intifada raging, this was the early stages of the Intifada, which broke out at the beginning of October, and many more Palestinians and Israelis had been killed at that point. Suicide bombings came later that evened up the score of death and destruction, but at that point there was a lot of anger in the streets of the West Bank and Gaza, in particular in the refugee camps. And Arafat, who had fed the refugees on the promise of a return to their homes in Israel, I believe did not dare to stand before them and speak the truth to them. He rather preferred to listen to those of his advisors who said, wait for George W. Bush, he'll get you a better deal. And so history's horse passed him by, leaving the Palestinians and Israelis mired in a misery that continues to this day, the latest manifestation of which was that horrendous war in Gaza that we saw at the beginning of this year. It was an immense tragedy, compounded by the fact that when George W. Bush came into office, the lesson he drew was that it was all a mistake to try to resolve this conflict. Better to promote democracy in the Middle East, and then peace would follow, he thought, from that. I went back with the newly elected Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon. Bush had asked me to stay on for 6 months until they got a replacement for me in Israel. And after the first meeting that Bush had with Sharon, he asked me to stay behind and I hadn't met him before, but he knew me as part of Clinton's team, and he said, "What happened?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, there's a lot of blame to go around, but it essentially amounts to a lack of leadership." And he stopped me. I had a few other things to say, but George W. Bush was not known for his curiosity. He wasn't, as a matter of fact. And so he said to me, "That's right, no leadership." He said, Barack and Clinton were two desperate men chasing after Yasser Arafat. They made him a very generous offer. He turned it down and resorted to violence. Now Sharon is Prime Minister. He's not going to offer what Barack offered and Arafat has already rejected. So there's no peace deal to be done here. No Nobel Peace Prize to be had. And he indicated that was the end of the conversation. And so after 8 years of trying to construct an edifice of peace that could resolve the conflict under President Bill Clinton, President George W. Bush walked away from the effort and let the Palestinians and Israelis have at it, which is exactly what they did, with thousands of people sacrificing their lives in the process. 7 years later, Bush came around to understanding that it was necessary to try and launched the Annapolis Peace Conference and process in his last year in office. But by then, it was too late. The whole edifice of peacemaking had been consumed in the flames of violence. For me, it was a personal tragedy. Having devoted my life to this effort, thinking that we were actually going to achieve it, and seeing it all come apart with such horrendous destruction in its wake, was something that I found very hard to deal with. It took me some time to come to terms with what went wrong. And that is what I've tried to do in this book. Writing it as a kind of lantern on the stern of the Clinton administration, trying to light up the wake that we left behind, so that sometime a new president would decide to devote his energies to peacemaking and could learn from our experiences. I did not know at the time that I finished the book, late last year, that Barack Obama would be elected Prime Minister of the United States, President of the United States, and that he would, on his second day in office, decide, like Clinton, that he was going to devote his energies to the effort to achieve a comprehensive peace, and appointed George Mitchell as his and Secretary of State Clinton's special envoy for Middle East peace. And so here we are again with a young, new president deciding to try. But the circumstances today are very different to the ones that Clinton experienced and that I outlined. Today, the landscape looks quite barren. Palestinians deeply divided, the Israelis deeply disillusioned, with a right-wing prime minister who, for the time being, has not been able to mouth the words, two-state solution, independent Palestinian state, and talks about peace with Syria, but no withdrawal from the Golan Heights. And you wonder how the president, with all the will in the world, is going to achieve his objective in these circumstances. Well, I do think that the lessons of the Clinton efforts are particularly apposite in these circumstances, even though they're not particularly auspicious. The first lesson is one that I think Obama already gets, which is that it's better to try, even if you can't see how you're going to succeed, than not to try at all. That the immense influence of the United States, even today, in the Middle East, when it's brought to power by a determined president, can impact on the calculations of all of the leaders there in ways that can just possibly promote opportunities, especially because there is now an exhaustion factor. People have simply had enough of this conflict. And there is also a fear factor. And fear is always a better motivator in the Middle East than hope, although hope is very important. And that leads to the second lesson, which is that when the United States decides to involve itself in the effort to make peace in the Middle East, it's very important that it focus on shaping the strategic context in which the leaders in the region are going to be operating, rather than getting itself involved in the weeds of the negotiations, which is a time-honoured tactic of both sides, drag us down into the weeds so that they can level the playing field. Shaping the strategic context is particularly important today because out there is a bid for dominance in the region coming from Iran. And Iran, through its influence in Baghdad, its alliance in Damascus, its proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hamas in Gaza, is able now to exploit the Arab-Israeli conflict in a way that is promoting its influence in the Arab-Israeli heartland. This is deeply threatening to not just to Israel, but to the Sunni Arab leaders as well. They see Iran meddling in their backyard, trying to assert what they see as Shia Persian dominance in the Sunni heartland. And that is simply unacceptable to them. The threat that they perceive is a little bit different from the threat that Israel perceives. Israel is focused on Iran's nuclear program, which they see as posing an existential threat to the survival of the Jewish state. The Arabs are concerned about something else. It is that Ahmadinejad and Nasrallah of Hezbollah and Khalid Mashal of Hamas are making the argument to their people over their heads that violence and terrorism and defiance of the international community and threats to destroy Israel can better meet the aspirations of the Palestinians and the Arabs and the Muslims than the alternative that these Arab state leaders espouse, which is negotiations, peace agreements, resolution of conflict, and acceptance of Israel. And that message is resonating in a way that really begins to threaten their own legitimacy. So they have to find a way to counter it. Barack Obama has the opportunity in this regard to shape a strategic context in ways that could bring the Arabs and Israelis together to focus on and counter the common threat that they perceive from Iran. And in that sense, there is a certain opportunity. There's also an opportunity that comes from the fact that Iran's ally, Syria, has for the last 4 years said clearly that it wants to make peace with Israel. When the president of Syria says he wants to make peace with Israel at the same time as his ally, the president of Iran, says he wants to destroy Israel, wipe it off the map, you can see that there's some kind of fundamental difference there. I was just in Damascus 3 weeks ago, and it's very clear that they would like to move quickly towards a resolution of the conflict with Israel, and that they believe that Netanyahu is the man to deal with because as a leader from the right wing, if he makes the deal, he won't have to worry like Barak did about bringing his people along because the parties of the center and the left will be supporting him. A peace deal between Israel and Syria, or even just the effort to bring Syria into the peace camp, can have fairly profound consequences in terms of this shaping of the strategic context. For Syria provides the conduit for Iran's influence into the Arab-Israeli heartland. It's through Damascus that arms and financial support flows to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hamas's external headquarters are in Damascus. And they get their support and instructions from Tehran in Damascus. So if you could cut that conduit, you could do much to deflate the cockiness of Iran's leaders about dominating the region. They'd suddenly start to look not like they were dominating the region, but rather being left behind by it. And here too there's an important lesson from Clinton's years. We tried to pursue a strategy of Syria first. And while we were doing that, we were pursuing a policy of containment of Iran. And what the Iranians came to understand was that they could break out of their containment if they screwed up our efforts to make peace with Syria.